Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that a trade policy designed to protect the nation's industry could end up crippling its consumers and empowering its biggest competitor? How can a single decision rooted in economic nationalism trigger a global realignment of trade, innovation, and power? In the charged arena of international trade politics, rhetoric often serves as the opening salvo in conflicts that have profound and lasting economic consequences. When the United States administration declared its intention to impose a tremendous tariff on lumber, the justification was framed in the language of national strength and self sufficiency. The assertion was bold and unequivocal. America did not need Canada's lumber. We have more lumber than they do, was the prevailing sentiment from Washington, a statement that dismissed decades of deeply integrated economic partnership. This narrative, however, fundamentally misread the intricate realities of the North American supply chain. Across the border, Canadian officials and industry leaders offered a starkly different perspective. They argued that the United States could not simply will a new supply chain into existence. The infrastructure, resources, and sheer volume of timber required to replace Canadian imports were not readily available. Canada, they maintained, was not engaging in unfair trade practices like dumping. Rather, it was an essential partner fulfilling a critical demand that the U.S. market could not satisfy on its own. These initial verbal clashes set the stage for a policy decision that would test the limits of protectionism. What began as political theater soon hardened into action when Washington officially slapped new national security tariffs on imported Canadian lumber, a move that sent immediate and violent tremors through the market. The reaction was not delayed or subtle, it was instantaneous and chaotic. Within days of the tariffs being enacted, commodity markets went wild. The price of lumber, a foundational material for the American construction industry, soared past $650 per thousand board feet, reaching a staggering peak not seen in years. This was not merely a fluctuation for traders to speculate on, it was a direct economic shock that rippled from Wall Street straight into the heart of the American dream, the housing market. For countless builders, developers, and prospective homeowners, the abstract language of trade policy had suddenly materialized as a concrete and costly barrier. The price spike wasn't a distant problem. It was a direct hit to budgets and balance sheets across the country, signaling the beginning of a period of intense volatility and economic pain that would reshape industries and lives on both sides of the border. The core of the American dilemma lay in a stubborn economic fact that the tariffs sought to ignore: an overwhelming and structural dependence on Canadian lumber. The United States, despite its vast forests, does not produce enough softwood lumber to meet its own domestic demand, particularly for residential construction. The numbers tell a story of deep integration. The nation imports approximately one-third of all the lumber it consumes, a significant figure that underscores its reliance on foreign supply. Of that massive volume of imported wood, nearly 85% originates from the forests and sawmills of Canada. This is not a casual trade relationship, but a foundational pillar of the American construction sector. Annually, Canada supplies around 12 billion board feet of softwood lumber to the United States, a staggering amount that accounts for nearly a quarter of the total American demand. To put this in perspective, this single source of lumber is responsible for framing millions of American homes, businesses, and infrastructure projects each year. This reliance created a critical vulnerability when the tariffs were imposed. The central assumption of the protectionist policy that American mills could simply ramp up production to fill the void crumbled under scrutiny, even if every single sawmill in the United States operated at absolute maximum capacity, running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The nation would still face a monumental shortfall of more than 3.2 billion board feet. The domestic industry as it stood was simply not equipped to close such a cavernous gap. Industry specialists and economic analysts had long argued that replacing the Canadian share of the supply chain was not a matter of flipping a switch. Their projections, even under the most optimistic conditions imaginable, scenarios involving record breaking investment, full staffing at every mill, and the rapid construction of brand new facilities, suggested it would take close to a decade for the United States to achieve lumber independence. Furthermore, that 10-year projection was itself contingent on a series of highly improbable variables, including the availability of sufficient harvestable timber, the willingness of investors to pour billions into a historically cyclical industry, and the ability to find and train a skilled labor force to run the new and existing mills. The reality on the ground was far from this idealized scenario. Most American sawmills were already running near full tilt, operating at roughly 95% of their capacity. They were not holding back production, they were pushing their existing infrastructure to its limits. These operations were simultaneously grappling with a host of persistent challenges that hampered any potential for significant expansion. A chronic shortage of skilled labor made it difficult to staff additional shifts, while aging equipment was prone to breakdowns and operated with lower efficiency than modern machinery. The outcome of this supply side crisis was visible everywhere construction takes place, from sprawling suburban developments to urban infill projects. Costs were rising far faster than wages, forcing builders to spend more for every 2x4 and every sheet of plywood, and prospective buyers watched helplessly as home prices climbed further and further beyond their reach. The consequences of this backfired policy reverberated throughout the American economy, with the most acute pain felt in the housing sector. The dream of home ownership, a cornerstone of American prosperity, was pushed further out of reach for millions. As lumber prices jumped, builders were forced to make impossible choices. Many halted projects mid construction, leaving skeletal frames exposed to the elements as they waited for material costs to stabilize. Others were forced to pass the exorbitant costs directly to consumers, causing new home prices to surge. Economic analysts from respected institutions like the Brookings Institution and the National Association of Home Builders issued dire warnings. Their models indicated that for every $10,000 increase in the cost of a new home, millions of potential buyers, particularly first time and lower income families, would be priced out of the market entirely. The very policy that was ostensibly designed to protect American jobs was now actively squeezing American families, slowing down the pace of construction, and driving prices for a basic necessity higher than ever before. The impact was quantified with alarming clarity by the National Association of Home Builders. Their research established a direct and painful formula. For every 1% increase in the price of lumber, the total cost of constructing an average single family home rose by over $1,000. With lumber prices climbing relentlessly toward $765 per thousand board feet, this translated into a sudden and punishing surcharge of more than $10,000 for the exact same home, with no improvement in materials, craftsmanship, or size. This tariff tax was a direct hit to the affordability of housing nationwide. Simultaneously, the policy failed to achieve its primary stated objective: to stimulate a renaissance in the domestic forestry sector. The promised job growth never appeared. Protected by the tariff wall, U.S. mills were still unable to effectively compete. They remained constrained by the same systemic issues: outdated equipment that was expensive to run and maintain, high operating costs, and a shallow pool of available labor. Instead of catalyzing investment and revitalization, the policy created severe bottlenecks in the supply chain. It failed to spur domestic production in any meaningful way, but it succeeded spectacularly in driving up costs for builders, families, and developers. The blunt assessment from think tanks like Brookings summed it up perfectly. Tariffs on lumber do not protect industry, they make everyday Americans poorer. The reality was plain to see on construction sites across the country, where the rising cost of wood became a symbol of a policy that had delivered economic pain instead of prosperity. By mid 2025, it was undeniable that the strategy had backfired, weakening one of the economy's most vital sectors and fanning the flames of broader inflation. While the U.S. economy strained under the weight of self inflicted costs, Canada's leadership chose a markedly different path. Instead of engaging in a tit for tat trade war and meeting tariffs with retaliatory measures, Ottawa focused on a long term strategy of resilience and adaptation. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government understood that the crisis also presented an opportunity. The first move was to stabilize the domestic industry. A $500 million package was introduced to help softwood producers absorb the initial shock and begin the crucial work of diversifying their exports to reduce their historic dependence on American buyers. This was not a bailout, but a strategic investment in the industry's future. Soon after, the federal government fortified this effort with another $1.2 billion, equivalent to about 870 million in US dollars, specifically designed to shield the sector from anti-dumping duties and strengthen its competitive foundation on the global stage. This federal initiative was mirrored by ambitious goals at the provincial level. In British Columbia, a province whose economy is deeply intertwined with the forestry sector, the Minister of Forests, Ravi Parmar, set a clear and ambitious target: redirect at least 10% of lumber exports away from the United States and into new emerging markets. This approach was less about fighting back against Washington and more about evolving beyond a single customer model. Government reports and industry analyses began to frame the challenge as an opening to reimagine how Canadian lumber could fit into the global supply chain. Provinces like British Columbia and Alberta, long accustomed to the steady and predictable rhythm of U.S. demand, suddenly became dynamic centers of new investment, technological innovation, and aggressive trade expansion. A combination of infrastructure projects to improve port logistics, grants for the modernization of sawmills, and a flurry of overseas trade missions worked in concert to turn the short term crisis into a powerful catalyst for transformation. As Washington was busy raising barriers, Canada was methodically building connections, positioning its lumber industry not only to survive the trade dispute, but to thrive in a new era of global competition. The contrast between the two neighbors grew sharper and more defined as the months passed. For decades, the North American lumber trade had been defined by a singular dominant flow. Nearly 90% of Canadian lumber exports had traveled south into the vast American market, a reliance that had seemed unshakable. The tariff shock, however, fractured that long standing pattern with surprising speed. Spurred by government support and the urgent need for new customers, Canadian producers began a concerted push into new territories. Their target list was global, spanning continents and economies at different stages of development: South Korea, Vietnam, India, Australia, the United Kingdom, the European Union, and emerging markets across the Middle East and North Africa. The strategy quickly bore fruit. Japan, once a secondary customer for Canadian wood, increased its imports by roughly 26% in a single year, signaling renewed confidence in Canada's stability and reliability as a supplier. This was followed by a series of new trade deals with economic powerhouses like Germany and South Korea, which further solidified Canada's growing role in the Asia Pacific as a trusted and increasingly an environmentally conscious supplier. To support this global pivot, major forestry and logistics companies invested heavily in upgrading port facilities at Vancouver and Prince Rupert, expanding their capacity to handle the rising volume of global shipments. Each container of lumber that left Canadian shores for a destination other than the United States now represented more than a simple trade transaction. It marked a turning point in how the country viewed its place in the world economy. Canada was no longer just a supplier tethered to a single dominant market. It was becoming a formidable player on the global stage. By 2025, this strategic shift had yielded remarkable results, with Canadian firms boosting their shipments to markets outside the US by nearly 20%. This pivot was not just about finding new buyers for the same raw materials. It was part of a deeper evolution in the nation's industrial strategy. Higher lumber prices, ironically fueled by the US tariffs, resulted in larger revenues for Canadian companies like West Fraser, Canfor, and Interfor. These firms shrewdly reinvested their profits into new technologies and expanded their exports into markets where environmental standards and sustainable sourcing mattered more than politics. In Western Canada, mills modernized their operations and began a decisive move toward higher value production. The focus shifted away from exporting raw, unprocessed timber and toward advanced processed goods, from engineered timber products like cross laminated timber to high end furniture grade wood. This strategic move up the value chain was a clear signal that the balance of economic power within the North American lumber trade was changing. Each new contract signed in Europe or Asia carried a significance that extended far beyond revenue. It demonstrated that Canada was no longer defined by its dependency on the American market. It was setting its own course, driven by innovation and a new global vision. This new vision was ambitious: to position Canadian lumber as the green steel of the future. This rebranding was more than a marketing slogan. It was a strategic alignment with global trends towards sustainable development. As the world sought low carbon materials to advance sustainable construction and renewable energy projects, Canada was positioning its wood products as an essential solution. This was further bolstered by new sustainability agreements negotiated under the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, with the European Union, which added a layer of green credentials to Canadian exports. The very tariffs that had been intended to cripple the Canadian lumber industry were now, paradoxically, fueling its competitive edge abroad. This divergence in strategy created two fundamentally different industrial philosophies. In the United States, the tariff driven approach fostered an environment of short term thinking. The policy created immense market uncertainty, which, contrary to its goal, discouraged the very long term capital investment needed to modernize American sawmills. Why would a company invest hundreds of millions in a new facility when the protective tariffs could be altered or removed with a change in political administration? The result was a holding pattern where many U.S. producers focused on maximizing profits from the temporary price spike rather than on innovation or expansion. The economic pain was not confined to housing, it spread to other wood dependent industries, from furniture and cabinet manufacturing to large scale public infrastructure projects, all of which faced budget overruns and delays. The policy had intended to build a fortress around the American industry, but had instead created a prison of high costs and stunted growth. Meanwhile, Canada's strategy of global engagement fostered a culture of innovation. By aligning its forestry sector with international climate goals and ESG, environmental, social, and governance, investment criteria, Canada attracted a different kind of Capital One focused on long term sustainability. This alignment wasn't just theoretical, it translated into tangible advancements. Canadian firms became leaders in mass timber construction, developing technologies for building carbon sequestering high rises out of wood. They perfected certification processes that guaranteed sustainable forest management, making their products more attractive to environmentally conscious European and Asian markets. This focus on sustainability became a powerful form of soft power. In a world grappling with climate change, Canada was no longer just selling a commodity, it was selling a solution. Its reputation as a reliable, green, and innovative partner gave it a distinct geopolitical advantage. Nations seeking to decarbonize their economies began to see Canada not just as a supplier, but as a strategic ally in achieving their climate targets, a status that opened doors to deeper diplomatic and economic partnerships. The U.S. tariffs had inadvertently pushed Canada to build a more resilient, technologically advanced, and globally respected industry, while the American sector remained mired in the very challenges the policy was supposed to solve. In the end, the story of the U.S. lumber tariffs is a powerful lesson in the law of unintended consequences. What began as a defensive protectionist maneuver by the United States triggered a profound and unexpected transformation, one that ultimately placed Canada at the center of a changing global order. The policy, designed to secure American jobs and foster domestic industrial revival, backfired spectacularly in the US. It led to stalled housing projects, mounting material costs that fueled inflation, and a widening supply gap as domestic production failed to keep pace with demand. For many American families, the dream of home ownership slipped further away, a direct casualty of a trade policy that harmed the very people it claimed to protect. The expected resurgence in U.S. forestry never materialized, leaving the nation with a weakened construction sector and deepening its dependence on costly, inefficient systems. In Canada, however, the benefits of adaptation became increasingly visible. Exports to Asia and Europe continued their steady growth. Federal and provincial incentives helped the industry recover from the downturns of 2021 to 2023, enabling mills to reopen and modernize their equipment. Trade data showed that the country's share in global lumber exports had climbed steadily, edging it closer to major European producers. According to analysts at the Royal Bank of Canada, if the prevailing trends persisted, Canada was on track to become the largest lumber export hub outside of Northern Europe by the year 2027. This was not merely an economic shift, it reflected a broader realignment of influence. In a world increasingly reshaped by supply chain disruptions and geopolitical uncertainty, reliability had become its own form of power. Canada's demonstrated ability to deliver consistent, sustainable products made it a preferred partner for governments and industries seeking to stabilize their construction and energy sectors. By reducing its reliance on a single partner, Canada had diversified not only its markets, but its entire economic identity. It was no longer a mere extension of the U.S. housing supply chain. It had forged a new path as an independent force, shaping its own future on the world stage. Strategic investments in green technology, modern infrastructure, and global trade diversification were positioning it to lead a new era of sustainable construction worldwide. The North American lumber economy had been redefined, not by American protectionism, but by Canada's resilient and forward looking response to it.